Viper report. What is your visibility? The voice of Master Sergeant Marcus Thorne crackled over the radio, nearly swallowed by the howling wind. Near zero, sir. The sandstorm is here. I am on thermals only. Sergeant Elena Rostova's breathing was shallow but steady, a forced rhythm of calm in the chaos. The smell of ozone and hot sand stung her nostrils. The target is still in place. He has the detonation package. The clock is ticking, Elena. You have 30 seconds, maybe less, before this dust turns to concrete. Can you make the shot? There was no immediate answer. Only the shriek of the wind and the metallic clicks as she adjusted her scope, compensating for the thermal refraction caused by billions of suspended particles of sand. He's moving. 15 seconds. I have him. Her voice came back cold and sharp. But there is a problem. The convection currents are distorting the thermal image. It is like looking through running water. Make the call, Sergeant. No more time, no other choice. Shot away. The sun over forward operating base. Al-Sahra was not a source of light so much as a physical weight. It pressed down on the corrugated metal roofs, the canvas tents, and the very air itself, baking the dust into a fine pale powder that coated everything. Dust was not simply on things here, it was in them. It lived in the fibers of uniforms, the mechanisms of weapons, and the back of every throat. For Sergeant Elena Rostova, it was a constant, gritty reminder of where she was. She sat on a worn wooden crate inside the relative cool of the armory, her M2010 enhanced sniper rifle disassembled on a clean canvas mat before her. Each component was laid out in a precise, almost surgical order: the bolt, the trigger assembly, the chassis, the barrel. Her movements were methodical, economical, honed by thousands of hours of repetition until they were as unconscious as breathing. A dry cloth to wipe away the pervasive grit, a soft brush for the hard-to-reach recesses, a light application of oil that smelled acrid and clean. This was her ritual, her sanctuary. In the deliberate process of cleaning her rifle, she found a stillness that the rest of the world could not offer. Here she was not the only woman in a unit of Tier 1 operators. She was not the subject of unspoken skepticism or the recipient of glances that lasted a half-second too long. Here she was, simply a sniper, and her tool. The relationship was pure, governed by the unyielding laws of physics and mechanics. The rifle did not care about her gender. It cared only for a steady hand, a calm breath, and a perfect understanding of its capabilities. It was an unforgiving but honest partnership. Her teammates, good men, all did not understand this ritual. They saw it as an obsession, an unnecessary meticulousness. Their own weapon maintenance was efficient, a task to be completed. For Elena, it was a conversation. She felt the subtle wear on the bolt, noted the faint residue in the barrel, and understood what the rifle was telling her about its performance, about the fine veil of dust that could at 1,000 meters mean the difference between a hit and a miss, between life and death. As she worked, her mind drifted from the precise world of steel and oil to the far more complicated world of paper and ink. Tucked inside her pack, lying flat within a waterproof sleeve, was a half-written letter. The paper was creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. It was addressed to her mother, a woman who believed her daughter was a logistical analyst stationed safely in Germany. The lie was a necessary armor protecting not Elena, but the woman who had taught her to be gentle. How could she explain the dust? How could she describe a silence so profound it had its own sound, or a horizon that promised nothing but more of itself? A shadow fell over her. Rostova. She did not look up, her hands still moving with fluid grace as she reinserted the bolt into the receiver. The click it made was crisp, final. Master Sergeant. Master Sergeant Marcus Thorne stood over her, his arms crossed. He was a man carved from the same rock as the surrounding mountains, his expression a permanent mask of professional severity. He was a legendary operator, and he had made it quietly clear that he considered her presence on his team a liability assigned by a command structure eager to prove a political point. Sharp briefing in 5. Command tent. He said, his voice as dry as the desert air. There is a new objective. High priority. Elena finally looked up, her gaze meeting his. Her eyes were a pale, clear gray, and they held his without wavering. There was no defiance in them, only a calm, professional focus that mirrored his own. She nodded once. Understood. Thorn held her gaze for a moment longer, searching for something, a flicker of doubt perhaps, or a hint of the fear he believed every soldier ought to have. He found nothing but the steady stillness of a predator. He turned and left without another word. Elena finished reassembling her rifle, the cold, familiar weight settling back into a comforting whole. She placed it carefully in its case, her ritual complete. The letter and the woman she was when she wrote it was put away. The objective was waiting. The command tent was a pocket of artificial cold in the heart of the furnace. Industrial-grade air conditioners hummed a monotonous tune, fighting a losing battle against the heat that radiated through the canvas walls. The air was stale with the scent of recycled oxygen and nervous energy. Elena took her seat at the metal table, flanked by the other members of her SEAL team men, whose bodies were dense maps of muscle and scar tissue. They were a brotherhood forged in crucibles she could only imagine, and she remained an outsider orbiting their tight-knit world. Master Sergeant Thorn stood before a large digital screen, his silhouette stark against the projected satellite image. The picture showed a cluster of low, windowless buildings in a rocky canyon, miles from any known settlement. It looked like a forgotten scar on the face of the earth. This, Thorn began, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, is Serpent's Lair. Intelligence confirms it is a storage and transit depot for a significant quantity of VX nerve agent. Our objective is simple: infiltrate plant charges on the primary structural supports here and exfiltrate before detonation. We will create a surgical collapse, burying the chemical stockpile under tons of rock. He clicked a button, and lines of attack appeared on the map. Red arrows indicated the main assault team's path. A single blue dot labeled Viper was positioned on a ridge over a kilometer away from the main complex. Rostova, you will provide overwatch from this position. Thorn continued, his gaze flicking to her for a fraction of a second. Your primary role is to monitor for enemy reinforcements approaching from the East Valley. You are to engage only if the exfiltration is compromised. Do you understand? Elena felt a familiar hot sting of frustration. A support role, a babysitting job. He was putting her on the bench, assigning her the task with the lowest probability of engagement, positioning her so far from the objective that her skills were effectively neutralized, unless the entire mission had already gone catastrophically wrong. The men around the table shifted slightly, their expressions unreadable, but she knew what it meant. Thorn was protecting his team, and to him she was not yet a trusted part of it. When I understand my role, Master Sergeant, she said, her voice even. She kept her eyes on the screen, studying the topographical data overlaid on the image. The wind vectors, the projected thermal updrafts, the atmospheric density calculations. Her mind processed them automatically. Then she saw it. A detail so small, yet so critical. She waited for him to finish detailing the exfiltration route. When he paused, she spoke, not looking at him, but at the map. Master Sergeant, the proposed infiltration route for the assault team will take them along the western face of the canyon wall. That is correct, Thorn said, his tone clipped, daring her to question it. And you, According to the latest meteorological data for this region, she continued, her voice remaining calm and technical. The prevailing katabatic winds after sunset will channel directly down that canyon face. If there is any kind of chemical leak during the breach, even a minor one, the wind will carry the airborne contaminants directly into the team's path. They will be walking into an invisible cloud of it. Silence descended upon the room, broken only by the hum of the air conditioner. The other operators looked from Elena to the map, then to Thorn. They had not considered it. It was a sniper's calculation, a variable that only mattered to someone who had to account for every breath of wind between the muzzle and the target. Thorn stared at the screen for a long, hard moment. He zoomed in on the topographical lines, his jaw tight. He could not refute her logic. It was sound. It was undeniable. And he had missed it. The approach will be altered. He said finally, his voice tight with a grudging respect that was almost more insulting than his initial dismissal. He did not thank her or acknowledge her contribution directly. He simply moved on, outlining a new route from the east. The plan was better now. Safer. But as the briefing concluded, the atmosphere remained thick with unspoken tension. Elena had won a small battle of wits, proving her worth with data and logic. But she knew with a certainty that chilled her more than the artificial air that Thorn's trust was not something that could be won on a map. It would have to be earned in the dust and the chaos where calculations gave way to instinct. Later, in the stark privacy of her small quarters, Elena began the second part of her pre-mission ritual. The first part was for the rifle. This part was for herself. She laid out her go bag, the contents familiar and reassuring in their purpose. Spare batteries for the radio and optics checked and double-checked. High-energy ration bars arranged in a specific order. A compact medical kit. Each item was a node in a network of preparedness, a small victory against the chaos that awaited. The rustle of the ripstop nylon fabric was a dry, lonely sound in the heavy silence. With her gear ready, she allowed herself to retrieve the letter. She sat on the edge of her cot and unfolded the creased paper. The words she had already written seemed to belong to someone else, a daughter trying to paint a picture of mundane life. The weather is very dry here, but the nights are clear. We get to see so many stars. It was a pathetic truth, a tiny piece of reality offered up to hide the immensity of what she could not say. She picked up her pen, the tip hovering over the empty space below. What could she add? How could she bridge the chasm between this world and her mother's mother? A librarian lived in a world of quiet order, of paper and soft light, of kindness given and received without calculation. To speak of the weight of her rifle, the cold mathematics of a long-distance shot, or the gnawing tension that lived permanently in her stomach, would be an act of cruelty. It would be transplanting the desert's harshness into the gentle garden of her mother's peace of mind. The conflict paralyzed her. The soldier trained to compartmentalize and control warred with the daughter who longed for the simple comfort of being understood. The silence in the room seemed to press in, amplifying the unspoken fears she suppressed during the day. Fear of failure. Fear of the finality of a single mistake. And the deeper, more shameful fear that Thorn was right, that she did not truly belong here, that her presence was a risk to the men she was sworn to protect. Her hand trembled slightly. For a moment she thought of putting the letter away, of surrendering to the silence. But that felt like a different kind of failure. To deny the fear was to give it power. Instead, she lowered the pen to the paper, and in a steady, deliberate hand, she wrote a new sentence, a truth that was both a confession and a reclamation. I am still scared, Mom. The words sat on the page, stark and vulnerable. Admitting it did not make the fear disappear, but it changed its nature. It was no longer a shadowy beast to be fought in the dark, but a known quantity, something that could be measured, understood, and carried. It was part of the equation now, just like wind speed and bullet drop. She remembered standing in the recruiter's office years ago, her mother's worried face etched in her mind. She had not joined for glory or for adventure. She had joined because she had seen in small ways and large how fragile peace was, how easily the gentle and the good could be broken by the violent. Her mother had spent her life creating a safe space for others with books and quiet wisdom. Elena had simply chosen a different set of tools to do the same thing. She was here to be a wall, a shield, a silent guardian for the world her mother represented. She read the new sentence one more time. It was enough for now. It was everything. With a sense of resolved purpose, she carefully folded the letter and placed it back in its waterproof sleeve. She tucked it deep into her pack. It was not a letter to be sent. Not yet. It was an anchor. A private testament. The time for vulnerability was over. The mission was hours away. There was no more room for the daughter. Only the soldier could remain. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of noise and rotor wash. The twin engines of the V-22 Osprey screamed as they tilted, lifting the heavy aircraft off the dusty tarmac, with a shudder that vibrated through the deck plates and up into Elena's bones. Inside the troop bay, the air was thick with the potent smell of jet fuel and the metallic scent of weaponry. The dim red light cast the faces of the operators in demonic hues, each man lost in his own pre-mission headspace, a silent accord of intense focus. Just before takeoff, a final update had crackled through the command net. A low-pressure system was developing faster than anticipated. The forecast now included a moderate chance of high winds and sandstorms within the next 12 hours. For a moment, the mission hung in the balance. The disembodied voice of a distant commander weighing the risk against the ticking clock of the intelligence. The decision came quickly. The window of opportunity to hit Serpent's lair was closing. The mission was a go. Proceed as planned. A calculated risk. Elena did not like calculated risks, especially when the calculations were made by someone sitting in an air-conditioned room thousands of miles away. Her profession was about eliminating variables, not accepting them. As the Osprey banked sharply, she steadied herself and glanced out of the small, thick-paned window. The base shrank below them, a tiny island of order in an endless sea of ochre and burnt sienna. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. It was brutally beautiful. But it was not the sunset that held her attention. To the far south, hugging the curve of the earth, was a faint, almost imperceptible line of yellow-gray. It was not the color of normal clouds or evening haze. It was the color of dust, millions of tons of it churned up and suspended high in the atmosphere. It was the leading edge of a weather system far more significant than the forecast had suggested. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. This was a variable she could feel in her gut, a primal warning that transcended data and reports. The enemy, for all their brutality, was a known quantity. They operated according to tactics, logic, and human limitations. A sandstorm, however, answered to nothing. It could not be flanked, intimidated, or reasoned with. It was an impartial force of chaos that could blind sensors, choke engines, and turn a meticulously planned operation into a desperate struggle for survival. She saw one of the other operators, a man they called Hawkeye, who would be her spotter for this mission, looking out the same window. He caught her eye and gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He saw it too. They did not need to speak. Their shared understanding was communicated in that single gesture, a silent acknowledgement, that they were now flying towards two enemies, one they were prepared for, and one that was entirely beyond their control. The aircraft leveled out the roar of the engines, settling into a steady drone that was more of a physical pressure than a sound. The vibration was constant. Elena leaned her head back against the bulkhead, closing her eyes. She focused on her breathing, slowing it down, pushing the unease into a locked compartment in her mind. She could not control the weather. She could only control her reaction to it. But as the Osprey pushed on into the darkening sky, the image of that pale yellow line on the horizon remained burned into her thoughts. The storm was coming, and she had a terrible feeling it would arrive sooner than anyone expected. The descent was a controlled fall into blackness. The V-22 Osprey hovered low over the designated landing zone, its rotors kicking up a blinding vortex of dust and pebbles. One by one, the team fast-roped into the disorienting chaos below. Elena was the last one out. Her gloved hands slid down the thick rope in a practiced fluid motion, and her boots hit the hard-packed earth with a solid thud. Seconds later, the aircraft was gone, its roar receding into the night, leaving behind a ringing silence that was almost as deafening as the noise had been. They were in. The air was cooler now, but the wind had a sharp, abrasive edge to it. It whistled through the jagged rock formations of the canyon, carrying the first stinging messengers of the coming storm. Fine grains of sand whipped against their exposed skin and found their way into the smallest gaps in their gear. Thorne gave a series of silent hand signals. The team fragmented, melting into the shadows with the preternatural quietness of apex predators. Elena and Hawkeye acknowledged the command with a tap to their helmets and broke away from the main element, beginning their ascent towards the ridge designated as their overwatch position. Their movement was a slow, painstaking dance of stealth and patience. They flowed over the rocky terrain, using the deep shadows cast by the moon as their pathway. Every footstep was placed with deliberate care to avoid dislodging a loose stone. They communicated with a private language of hand gestures and subtle shifts in body weight, their teamwork so ingrained it had become instinct. Hawkeye, a lanky operator with an uncanny ability to spot details. Others missed, moved slightly ahead, scanning the terrain with night vision goggles. Elena followed her rifle slung across her back, her focus entirely on the path ahead. The wind grew stronger as they climbed a persistent, mournful howl that seemed to be trying to push them back down the slope. It tugged at their gear and forced them to lean into it as they moved. Elena could feel the grit of sand between her teeth. Her radio crackled with a burst of static, a reminder that the storm was not just a physical threat, but an electronic one as well. They were 50 meters from their destination, a natural rock shelf that the mission planners had promised would provide excellent cover and a clear line of sight to the target. It was then that they heard a low, grating sound from above. It was not loud, but it was wrong. Hawkeye froze, holding up a clenched fist. They listened motionless as a cascade of small rocks and gravel skittered down the cliff face, coming to rest exactly where their sniper nest was supposed to be. A recent wind-driven rockslide had sheared away the protective overhang, leaving the position useless, a rubble-strewn platform with no cover whatsoever. Frustration, cold and sharp, pricked at Elena. So much for meticulous planning. They were exposed, and their primary position was compromised before they had even set up. Hawkeye looked at her, his expression unreadable behind his goggles, but she could feel the unspoken question hanging in the air. Now what? Her eyes scanned the surrounding rock face, her mind racing, adapting. To their right, about 20 meters higher, was another outcrop. It was smaller, more exposed, and the climb would be more treacherous. But from that angle, the line of sight to the target complex would be even better. There was no other choice. Aborting was not an option, and going back down would waste precious time. She met Hawkeye's gaze and pointed upward with her chin. He gave a single sharp nod of assent. The decision was made. They would adapt. They would overcome. But as she started the difficult climb towards the new position, Elena could feel the full force of the wind trying to peel her from the rock. The perch she had chosen would offer no shelter. She would be facing the storm and the enemy completely on her own terms. The new perch was a precarious lip of rock, barely wide enough for two men to lie prone. It offered no cover, but the view was brutally perfect. Elena settled into position, the rough stone biting into her elbows and chest through the fabric of her uniform. The wind was a physical presence here, a relentless bully that tore at her, trying to find purchase and push her from the ledge. She anchored herself, becoming a part of the mountain, her body a stable platform for the rifle. Beside her, Hawkeye set up his spotting scope, his movements economical and precise. He murmured ranges and windage adjustments. His voice a low, calming presence in her ear, a thread of human order in the growing natural chaos. Target complex 1150 meters, wind gusting from your 9 o'clock at 20 knots. Elena dialed in the adjustments, her fingers moving with practiced certainty. She settled her eye to the scope of the M210. The world through the powerful lens was a circle of stark, high-contrast clarity. The depot below was bathed in the cold, artificial glare of floodlights. She could see two guards patrolling the perimeter, their movements lazy and predictable. Everything appeared exactly as the intelligence briefing had described. For a long while, nothing happened. It was the familiar patient waiting game of the sniper. Then, the rhythm of the scene changed. The headlights of a vehicle appeared cutting through the darkness of the eastern valley. It was a single armored jeep moving at a confident speed. It was not part of the expected patrol pattern. "I have a vehicle approaching from the east," she whispered into her microphone, her voice flat and professional. "Unscheduled." The jeep did not stop at the main gate, but drove directly into the central compound, pulling up near the largest of the three buildings. The doors opened. Two men got out, but it was the third figure emerging from the passenger side that drew Elena's complete focus. He was older with a short gray beard, and he carried himself with an air of unquestionable authority. He also carried a heavy-looking metallic case. "Hawkeye, do you have eyes on the passenger?" she murmured. "Affirmative." Hawkeye breathed, his own scope zoomed in. "Running facial recognition. Stand by?" The man gestured to the guards, who immediately became more alert, their posture stiffening. He was clearly in command. Elena tracked him in her scope as he walked towards the main building. Her crosshairs settled on his chest. A hypothetical shot. Simple mechanics. "I got him," Hawkeye's voice crackled with a new urgency. "Target is identified as Ibrahim Al-Masri. Repeat, we have a positive identification on Al-Masri." A spike of ice-cold adrenaline shot through Elena. Al-Masri. The architect. He was a master bomb maker, a high-value target on a level far beyond the local insurgents who ran this depot. He was not supposed to be here. His presence changed the entire nature of the threat. This was no longer just a weapons cache. With him here, it was a live bomb. As if to confirm her fears, Al-Masri stopped. He placed the metal case on the hood of the jeep and opened it. Even from over a kilometer away, Elena's high-powered optics could make out the contents with chilling clarity. Inside was not a weapon, but a complex array of electronics, a keypad, and a single prominent antenna. It was a remote detonation device, a dead man's switch on a massive scale. The assault plan was now obsolete. If Thorne's team breached the doors, Al-Masri would simply push a button. The mission would not just fail, it would end in the fiery chemical death of her entire team. The wind howled, trying to tear the rifle from her grip, but Elena's hands were rock steady. The weight of the mission had in an instant shifted from the assault team below to her lonely exposed position on this wind-swept ledge. Everything now depended on her. She keyed her microphone, her voice betraying none of the violent turmoil in her chest. "Command, this is Viper. Be advised we have a priority target. The package is a remote trigger." Elena's report landed in the team's encrypted channel with the force of a physical impact. For 3 full seconds, the only reply was the escalating hiss of static as the wind buffeted the radio transmitters. Hidden in the rocks less than 300 meters from the target, Thorn processed the information. A remote trigger. Al-Masri. The variables of his carefully constructed plan had not just changed. They had been thrown into a bonfire. "Viper, confirm visual." Thorn's voice came back tight and controlled, but laced with an undercurrent of disbelief. "You are 100% certain of the device's function." Certity's affirmative command. Elena replied, her eye never leaving the scope. Al-Masri was now speaking to the guards, gesturing with an air of absolute control. "The device is a multi-band transmitter with a reinforced antenna. Keypad entry suggests a dead man switch protocol. The assault team will trip a proximity sensor long before they reach the doors. This is a trap." On the command channel, the debate was short and brutal. "This could be a decoy, Marcus." One of the assaulters, a seasoned operator named Diaz, argued. "He could be trying to draw our sniper out. We go in hard and fast, we can be on him before he even knows we are there." Thorn was torn. His entire career, his every instinct was built around direct action. He trusted his men. He trusted their speed, their aggression, their training. To abort a plan this deep into an operation based on the word of a single distant observer went against his very nature. To base it on the word of Rostova, the variable he had never wanted on his team, was almost unthinkable. His bias was a cold, heavy weight in his gut. Was she seeing what she thought she was seeing? Or was she seeing what she was afraid of? The risk is too high. Elena's voice cut through the debate, colder and sharper than the wind. "The transmitter is military grade, not an improvised device. I can identify the make. It has a fail-safe biometric scanner next to the keypad. If he is neutralized, the signal dies with him. But if the breach is initiated, he will have at least a 10-second window to activate it. Your team will not cover 300 meters of open ground in 10 seconds. She was not just observing. She was analyzing, providing tactical intelligence that was irrefutable. She described the specific layout of the control panel, the type of locking mechanism on the case, details so precise they could only come from direct expert observation. She was not just a shooter, she was a technical expert. Thorn listened, the static crackling around her words. In that moment, he had to make a choice. He could trust his gut, his men, and the plan he had built. Or he could trust the calm, certain voice of the one person he had been determined to sideline. He had to decide if his own prejudice was now the single greatest threat to his team. The lives of every man under his command rested on his ability to see the battlefield for what it was, not what he wanted it to be. The silence stretched, filled only by the howl of the approaching storm. Down in the canyon, Al-Masri laughed at something one of the guards said, his hand resting casually on the lid of the case. Finally, Thorn keyed his mic. His voice was raw, as if the words were being scraped from his throat. "All call signs. Hold your positions. Repeat, all call signs, stand down. The assault is scrubbed." He took a breath. The next words would change everything. "Viper, the target is yours. You are cleared to engage." The weight of the words settled upon Elena heavier than her rifle, heavier than the mountain itself. The skepticism and the doubt were gone from Thorne's voice, replaced by something far more terrifying, complete and utter trust. The lives of her teammates were now resting on the steadiness of her hands alone. The command was given, and the sky answered. The yellow-gray line Elena had seen on the horizon hours ago arrived not as a weather front, but as a solid wall of churning sand. It slammed into the canyon with a deafening roar, a sound like the world being torn apart. The moon and stars vanished. The floodlights of the depot below were swallowed by the impenetrable gloom. Visibility dropped from a kilometer to less than an arm's length in the space of a single heartbeat. The wind was no longer a gust. It was a physical force, a solid mass of air and sand that hammered at their exposed position. Elena flattened herself against the rock, her body screaming in protest as the gale tried to rip her from her perch. Beside her, Hawkeye had his face buried in his arms, his only job now to survive and keep their communications gear from being sandblasted into oblivion. Through her standard scope, there was nothing. Only a swirling, monochromatic chaos. Her primary sense, the one she trusted above all others, was gone. She was blind. Viper status. Thorne's voice, shredded by static, fought its way into her ear. No visual. Repeat, no visual. She yelled back her own voice, immediately snatched away by the wind. She switched the optic on her rifle, flipping the thermal scope into place. The world reappeared, but it was a ghostly, nightmarish version of what had been there before. It was a landscape painted in shades of heat. The rocks around her were cool, dark gray. The muzzle of her own rifle glowed with a faint warmth. She found the depot again, a collection of warmer smudges in the distance, and she found him. Al-Masri was a bright, white-hot silhouette, his body heat a beacon in the cold chaos. He and his men were scrambling, clearly caught off guard by the storm's ferocity. He was moving towards his jeep, but there was a new, unforeseen problem. The thermal scope was not a perfect solution. The friction of billions of sand particles rubbing against each other in the air was generating its own heat signature. It created a shimmering, watery effect, a thermal fog that distorted the image, making it waver and swim as if she were looking through a current of running water. The clear, solid outline of the target was now a dancing, unstable ghost. A precise shot was becoming impossible. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. All the technology, all the training was being rendered useless by simple physics. She could see the target, but she could not trust what she was seeing. The heat signature could be millimeters or even centimeters away from the man's actual position. At this range, that was the difference between a neutralized threat and a harmlessly shattered rock. She realized then, with a terrifying clarity, that the equipment could no longer guide her. It could only provide a clue. The final decision, the final calculation would have to come from inside her. She would have to read the currents in the thermal fog, anticipate the shimmer and fire, not at where the target appeared to be, but where her instinct and experience told her he would be. She had to shoot through the ghost to hit the man. Her fear did not vanish. Instead, it sharpened, burning away every extraneous thought, every distraction, until only the problem remained. Her heartbeat, a frantic hammering just moments before, slowed to a steady, powerful rhythm in her ears. It was the only sound she could hear, now a metronome counting down the final seconds. T-Viper, he is getting in the vehicle. Thorne's voice blasted through the static, frayed with urgency. He is leaving. You are out of time. Take the shot. The world shrank to the shimmering, unstable image inside her thermal scope. The roaring of the storm faded into a dull, distant pressure. All that existed was the wavering, white-hot silhouette of Al-Masri and the crosshairs that seemed incapable of holding it still. The voices in her headset became distorted echoes of a world she no longer inhabited. Viper report. What is your status? It was Thorn, his voice frayed, fighting the storm. Almost zero visibility command. I have a thermal image only. Elena's breath was steady, a forced calm in the center of the hurricane. The smell of ozone and hot sand filled her nostrils. The target is still active. He is carrying the detonation package. The clock is running, Elena. You have 30 seconds, maybe less, before this dust becomes a concrete wall. Can you make the shot? There was no immediate answer. Only the quiet click, click, click of her fingers on the turret knob, making micro-adjustments for a dozen variables at once. Windage, bullet drop, Coriolis effect pulling the bullet sideways over its long journey, and the most damning variable of all the thermal lag, the ghost in the machine. She was aiming at a memory, a heat signature from a moment ago, and she had to predict where the physical body would be now. Her plan was insane, born of desperation. 2 shots fired in such rapid succession that they would almost sound like one. The first shot was not for Al-Masri, it was for the antenna on the detonation case. A smaller target, a harder target, but the one that mattered most. The second shot, a fraction of a second later, was for the man himself. He's moving. 15 seconds. Thorn's voice was a countdown to apocalypse. Oh no, I see him, she said, her own voice sounding foreign, detached. But there is a problem. The thermal convection is warping the image. It is like looking through a river. We make the decision, Sergeant. The use of her rank was not a rebuke. It was a transfer of command. The decision was now hers alone. Through the shimmering distortion, she saw Al-Masri reach the jeep's door. He paused, turning slightly, and raised a hand. Was he shielding his face from the sand, or was he reaching for the keypad? There was no more time for calculation. The final numbers were not in the data tables or the wind meter. They were in her bones, in the accumulated instinct of 1,000 days spent on the range and 100 nights spent watching the world through a scope. She had to trust the part of her that Thorn had doubted, the part that felt the world as much as it saw it. In her mind, a profound silence descended. The fear and the focus which had been warring inside her now merged into a single sharp point of absolute clarity. She was no longer a soldier. She was an instrument. Her finger rested on the trigger, the metal cold against her skin. She shifted her point of aim slightly up and to the left of the shimmering heat source leading the ghost. She exhaled her breath, leaving her body in a slow, controlled stream until there was nothing left. In the quiet, empty space between heartbeats, she pressed the trigger. Shot away, she breathed into the microphone. The M2010 bucked against her shoulder, a violent, controlled explosion. The sound was instantly devoured by the storm, but Elena did not hear it. She was already working the bolt, ejecting the spent casing, chambering the next round, her eyes never leaving the scope, her mind already on the second shot that had to follow. The first bullet was gone, a tiny piece of metal on a journey of more than 1,000 meters through a hurricane carrying the fate of them all. The time it took for the first bullet to travel from her rifle to the target was just under 2 seconds. For Elena, in that compressed sliver of eternity, the world moved with excruciating slowness. Her entire being was focused on the follow-through, on the single fluid motion of cycling the bolt. Her right hand moved with an aggressive precision that was a counterpoint to the stillness of the rest of her body. Pull back, eject, push forward, lock down. The empty brass casing spun away into the roaring darkness, its tiny metallic clink against the rock utterly lost in the storm. Her shoulder ached from the recoil, a deep, jarring punch that the wind tried to exploit, pushing against the rifle, attempting to wrench it from her grasp. She fought it, her core muscles screaming as she held the weapon steady, her eye already back on the scope, searching through the wavering thermal river for any sign of impact. The stakes were absolute. Destroying the antenna was not enough. Al-Masri was still a threat. He could have a secondary trigger, a manual override. The job was not finished. Then she saw it. A tiny, brilliant white flare near the main heat signature, followed by a spray of smaller, rapidly cooling fragments. It was the kinetic energy of the bullet impacting the antenna, shattering the metal and electronics into superheated shrapnel. Hit. The first shot was a clean hit. Through the thermal distortion, she saw the silhouette of Al-Masri flinch and freeze. It was not a reaction of pain, but of pure, unadulterated shock. His head snapped in the direction of the detonator case. For a single priceless moment, his focus was not on escape, not on the storm, but on his broken toy. His surprise had rendered him motionless. It was the window she had prayed for. There was no sense of triumph in her mind, no thrill of success. The first shot had simply been one step in a two-step process. Her focus narrowed again, becoming a laser point of cold, mechanical intent. Her crosshairs, which had drifted a few inches from the recoil, settled back onto the center of the wavering thermal mass. She adjusted her aim almost imperceptibly, compensating for the target's sudden stillness. She tasted the salt of sweat on her upper lip. Her lungs, which had been empty, drew in a short, sharp breath. This was the shot that counted. This was the one for her team. For Thorne, who had placed his faith in her against his own judgment. For Hawkeye, who lay beside her, trusting her completely. She pressed the trigger. The rifle kicked again, harder this time it seemed. The sequence repeated itself, the violent push, the fight against the wind, the automatic cycling of the bolt. But this time, when her eye returned to the scope, the scene had changed dramatically. The brilliant white-hot silhouette of Ibrahim Al-Masri was gone. In its place, there was a rapidly expanding and cooling splash of heat against the side of the Jeep like a spilled cup of coffee. Then nothing. The heat signature that had been the center of her universe for the last several minutes had been instantly and completely extinguished. Silence. Not in the world outside, the storm still raged with unabated fury. The silence was in her headset. It was on the command net. The half-dozen men whose lives had been hanging in the balance were waiting breathless. And it was inside her own mind. The intense, razor-sharp focus dissolved, leaving behind a vast, hollow emptiness. The job was done. The rifle was still hot, a faint warmth seeping through Elena's glove. The world outside the scope remained a raging chaos of wind and sand, indifferent to the life-or-death drama that had just concluded. For several long seconds, the only sound in her ear was the roar of the storm and the violent static it created. No explosion had followed. That was the first good sign. The chemical weapons remained dormant, buried under their concrete shells, but the silence from her team was unnerving. They were all still in their positions, waiting. Had they seen what she had seen? Did they trust the ghostly images of a thermal scope as definitive proof? The lack of an explosion proved that the remote detonator had not been activated, but it did not confirm that the threat was permanently neutralized. All call signs, sit rep. Thorne's voice cut through the static, tight and controlled. He was asking for a situation report, but it was a question directed at the universe as much as his team. One by one, they checked in. Alpha team holding position. Negative contact. Bravo team secure. No movement observed. Their voices were strained, coiled springs of tension. They were all staring into the same blinding wall of sand, relying on the word of one person. Viper. Thorne said, his voice dropping the question implicit. Confirm the kill. Elena took a slow breath, letting the adrenaline begin its long retreat from her veins. Her eye was still pressed to the scope, scanning the area where Al-Masri had fallen. There was no movement. The thermal splash on the side of the vehicle was fading as the wind and sand scoured the heat away. The other figures, the guards, had vanished, either having fled in the storm or taken cover. They were no longer a strategic threat. The target's heat signature is gone. She reported, her voice a low monotone. The primary threat is neutralized. I say again, the threat is neutralized. There was another pause, a final moment of collective held breath. And then Thorne's voice came through again, and all the professional tightness, all the skepticism was gone. It was replaced by a wave of profound, undisguised relief that washed over the entire network. Chuck confirmed. He said the single word, almost a sigh. Target is down. Viper, you did it. The dam of professional silence broke. A cacophony of triumphant shouts, whoops, and relieved laughter erupted over the comms. Diaz, the operator who had questioned the call, was the loudest. Hell of a shot, Viper, hell of a shot. The praise was genuine, a raw and unfiltered acknowledgement of what she had accomplished. They were alive because of her. But Elena felt strangely disconnected from their celebration. The wave of relief they were feeling did not reach her lonely perch. The crushing weight of responsibility had been lifted so suddenly that she was left feeling hollow, lightheaded, and profoundly tired. There was no elation, no sense of victory. There was only the quiet, echoing finality of the act. She had done her job. A man was dead. Her team was safe. It was a simple, brutal equation. While the men celebrated over the radio, Elena pulled one hand away from her rifle. She reached into a protected pouch on her vest and carefully withdrew the folded waterproof sleeve containing her letter. The storm still howled around her, a meaningless and distant noise. In the sudden, profound stillness of her own mind, she simply held it, the paper, a fragile human thing in a world of violent certainties. The jubilant voices on the radio eventually faded back into professional brevity as Thorne gave new orders for a tactical withdrawal, but Elena did not move. Her primary task was complete, but the discipline ingrained in her was a rigid spine. The engagement was over, but the mission was not. She remained prone, rifle in place, her thermal scope still scanning the ghostly, storm-swept landscape below. Her survival and her team's depended on not letting victory breed complacency. Yet, emotionally, she was adrift. The cheers of her teammates had only served to highlight her profound sense of isolation. They were celebrating a shared victory, a collective survival. She was grappling with the intimate, solitary reality of the act itself, the cold calculus, the steady hand, the extinguished heat signature. It was a burden she bore alone. With her left hand, she carefully unfolded the letter, shielding it against her body to protect it from the worst of the wind. The paper felt alien here, a fragile artifact from another universe. Her eyes found the last sentence she had written in the sterile quiet of her room back at the base. "I'm still scared, Mom." The words seemed to mock her now. Was she scared in that final moment? She searched her memory of the last few minutes not for the tactical details, but for the feeling. The fear had been there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it had been distant. It had been a passenger, not the pilot. Something else had taken control, a lifetime of training, a deep sense of duty, a focus so absolute it had burned fear into fuel. She realized then that her confession to her mother was only half the truth. Fear was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. It was the price of admission for doing something that mattered. Courage was not the absence of fear. It was the assessment that something else was more important. The wind began to shift, the sand-blasting intensity lessening slightly. In its place, the first heavy cold drops of rain began to fall. They hissed as they struck the hot barrel of her rifle and splattered against the waterproof sleeve of the letter. The dust was turning to mud. She fumbled inside her vest for the pen. Holding the paper steady against the rifle stock, she added one more sentence, the words flowing with a certainty that had been absent before. But I choose to stand in the storm so that others do not have to. That was it. That was the entire truth. It was not a grand philosophy, but a simple declarative choice. It was the answer to every unspoken question, the reason for the dust in her throat and the weight on her soul. This was her purpose, written not for her mother, but for herself. She read the words one last time, the rain starting to streak the page. A sense of quiet resolution settled over her, a peace far deeper and more meaningful than the noisy elation of victory. She had not conquered her fear. She had given it a purpose. A sound different from the wind and the rain cut through the noise. The crunch of boots on gravel. She did not startle. She had been tracking their heat signatures for the last 2 minutes. Thorn and Hawkeye were making their way up the treacherous final stretch to her position. She slowly folded the letter, her movements deliberate, and tucked it away. She settled back behind her rifle, her eye to the scope, a silent sentinel once more. The conversation that was about to happen would have no words, and she was ready for it. Hawkeye arrived first, scrambling over the final lip of rock, and immediately moving to secure their perimeter, his rifle scanning the area below. He gave Elena a quick, sharp nod, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and relief. It was a clear, unambiguous message. You saved us. She acknowledged it with a slight dip of her own chin. Then Thorn pulled himself up. He moved with a heavy weariness that had not been there before the mission began. The storm was beginning to break the solid wall of sand, thinning into a thick, gritty haze. A weak, bruised-looking light began to filter through from the setting sun. The rain was steady now, a soft drumming on their helmets that washed the dust from the air. Thorn did not speak. He walked over to Elena's position, his boots making a soft, crunching sound on the wet stone. He crouched beside her, his gaze sweeping over the scene below, professionally confirming the absence of any remaining threat. He then turned his attention to Elena. His eyes, pragmatic and intense, assessed her condition, checking for signs of injury shock or fatigue. It was the same procedural check he would give any operator. He then looked at her rifle, noting its condition, the position of the bolt, the heat still shimmering from the barrel. He was all business, his expression a mask of professional detachment. Elena remained silent, meeting his gaze without expectation. She did not need his praise. The frantic shouts over the radio had been for the team, for the release of tension. This moment was something different, something more personal. His eyes then drifted to the pouch on her vest, where she had just secured her letter. He had seen her tuck it away. His gaze lingered there for a fraction of a second, but it was long enough. He knew it was something private, a link to a world outside this canyon of death. Finally, he looked up and met her eyes. In that long, silent moment, the entire dynamic between them was rewritten. There was no trace of the skepticism she had seen in the briefing room. The doubt was gone. In its place was something far more complex. He looked at her, and she saw a flicker of understanding, an acknowledgement of the immense pressure he had placed upon her and the impossible weight she had borne without flinching. She saw respect, hard-won and absolute, And beneath it all, she saw something that looked almost like an apology, not for his doubt, but for his failure to see her clearly from the beginning. He said nothing. Words would have been insufficient, clumsy things. They would have cheapened the moment, reducing her act to a simple accomplishment that could be summarized and filed in a report. The official record would read, "Mission Success." It would never capture the truth of the storm, the ghost in the thermal scope, or the choice she had made. Thorne knew that, and in that moment, she knew that he knew. He gave a single, slow nod. It was a gesture of command, of dismissal, and of profound respect all at once. It said, "Job well done. Now let's go home." Elena felt a sense of validation so deep and quiet, it was almost overwhelming. It was more potent than any medal, more meaningful than any citation. It was the silent acknowledgement of a fellow warrior. She had not proven herself to him. She had revealed herself, and he had finally seen. She nodded back once. The exchange was complete. "Well, let's move out." Thorne set his voice now back to its usual gravelly tone as he turned to Hawkeye. The spell was broken. They were soldiers again. They began the careful process of packing their gear for the long trek to the exfiltration point. The mission was over. The ride back inside the V-22 Osprey was the polar opposite of the journey out. The tense, coiled energy was gone, replaced by a heavy, bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to press every man into his seat. The red interior lights of the troop bay did little to hide the grime, sweat, and fatigue etched on each face. The air, still smelling of jet fuel, was now thick with the scent of sweat and spent cordite, the unique perfume of mission accomplished. No one spoke much. There was no need. The silence was comfortable, filled with a shared understanding of what they had just endured. The post-mission procedures began, each man moving with an economy of motion that spoke of endless training. Magazines were cleared, weapons were field-stripped and cleaned as best as possible, and gear was methodically stowed. A medic moved down the line, checking for injuries, patching minor cuts, and handing out painkillers. It was a quiet, professional ritual, a way to decompress the mind by focusing the hands on familiar tasks. Elena sat slightly apart, her own rifle already cleaned and cased. The deep ache in her shoulder from the rifle's recoil was a dull, persistent throb. The adrenaline had long since drained away, leaving a hollow space in its wake. She watched her teammates, observing the subtle shifts in their dynamic. Before the mission, their interactions with her had been correct, professional, but always with a thin, invisible wall between them. Now the wall was gone. Diaz, the operator who had been the most vocal in his celebration, caught her eye from across the bay. He did not say anything, but he raised his canteen in a silent toast before taking a long drink. It was a simple gesture, but it was freighted with meaning. It was an apology, an acknowledgement, and an acceptance all in one. A moment later, Hawkeye, who had finished cleaning his own carbine, came over. He wordlessly handed her a bottle of water, then clumsily, almost shyly, patted her once on the shoulder before moving back to his seat. The touch was brief, but it was solid and real. It was the touch of a comrade, of a brother in arms. In that small, unspoken act, Elena understood something profound. She had been so focused on earning Thorne's trust, on proving her worth to the man in command, that she had failed to see the bigger picture. Respect, the kind that truly mattered in this world, was not handed down from on high. It was built sideways, forged in the shared crucible of a mission. It was earned not with a single spectacular act, but with the quiet demonstration of competence and reliability when lives were on the line. They did not trust her now because she had made an impossible shot. They trusted her because when the moment came, she had done her job. The steady drone of the Osprey's engines was a hypnotic lullaby, and despite the ache in her body, Elena felt her eyelids grow heavy. The tension of the last 36 hours was finally loosening its grip. She leaned her head back against the vibrating bulkhead, the quiet camaraderie in the bay, a more comforting blanket than she could have imagined. They were going back to the same dusty base, to the same routine, but something fundamental had shifted. The question was no longer whether she belonged. The only question now was what came next. They returned to Alsara in the deep, quiet hours before dawn. The base was still, the air washed clean by the rain, carrying a crisp, cool scent that felt like a baptism. After the final debriefing, a dry, factual affair where Thorne reported the mission's success as a successful team effort neutralizing a high-value target. The operators dispersed to their quarters, the adrenaline finally giving way to the crushing weight of gravity. Elena did not sleep. Instead, she sat on the same wooden crate in the armory where this had all begun. Her rifle lay disassembled on the canvas mat, each piece waiting for the familiar ritual of cleaning. But first, she took out the letter. In the pale, pre-dawn light, filtering through the armory's open door, she read it one last time. The words written by the anxious daughter, the confession of fear from the soldier in the storm, and the quiet statement of purpose that followed. It was a complete story, now a perfect circle. The question was what to do with it. Sending it felt wrong. The words were too raw, too real for the peaceful world her mother inhabited. It would be a burden, not a comfort. She thought of the official report. Team effort. Her name would be in it, one among many. There would be no special commendation, no public acknowledgement of the 2 impossible shots fired through a hurricane. The bureaucracy of war had no language for moments like that. Her heroism, if it could be called that, would remain as unseen as the path of the bullets that had saved them. And she found to her own quiet surprise that she was okay with that. The respect in Thorne's eyes, the nod from Diaz, the simple, solid pat on the shoulder from Hawkeye, those were the only commendations she needed. Glory, she was beginning to understand, was not always a bright public flame. Sometimes it was a private, steady ember that you carried deep inside yourself. The first rays of sunlight crested the distant mountains, spilling liquid gold across the desert floor. The sky scrubbed clean of dust, and clouds was a brilliant, breathtaking blue. The storm was over. Elena looked at the letter in her hand, then at the dawn. She had stood in the storm. She had not faltered. And because of that, the sun was rising on another day for people who would never know her name, including the woman who had taught her to be gentle. That was the only victory that mattered. With a sense of finality, she folded the letter. She did not tear it up. It was too important for that. It was a part of her now. When she returned to her quarters, she placed it in the bottom of her footlocker, alongside a few other small private treasures, mementos of a life lived in the quiet spaces between missions. It was not a letter to be sent. It was a map of who she was. She returned to the armory. The sun was higher now, its warmth beginning to touch the air. She picked up a clean cloth and a bottle of gun oil. Her hands began the familiar methodical ritual of cleaning her rifle. The metallic clicks and soft whispering sounds of the cloth on steel were the only sounds in the quiet morning. One mission was over. Another would come. Elena Rostova, Sergeant Seal daughter, was ready. The dust had settled, and in the stillness of the new day she had found her peace. Elena Rostova's journey into the heart of the storm is more than a tale of military precision. It is a meditation on the nature of quiet courage. It reminds us that the most profound heroism is often found not in the roar of victory, but in the silent personal choices made when no one is watching the victories known only to the self. These are the stories of those who, like Elena, choose to stand against the wind, not for a medal or for recognition, but so that others might live in peace. If narratives that honor this deep internal strength and celebrate the dignity of the unsung hero resonate with you, we invite you to subscribe to our channel to ensure you do not miss the powerful stories yet to come. Thank you for sharing in this moment of stillness and resolve.